In the dead of winter, December 1952, the icy wind clawed through the dense mists surrounding the Alaskan coast, and atop a lonely rock formation 3 miles off Ketchikan stood the Ketchikan Point Lighthouse, a skeletal sentinel against the violent breath of the Pacific. Its keeper, 62-year-old Edgar McClellan, was a former Navy man known for his precise routines and stoic presence, a figure made of salt and silence who had called that rock his home for over 30 years. He wasn't just the lighthouse's caretaker, he was its soul. His weathered hands kept the glass of the Fresnel lens spotless. His logs were documented with military precision, and each evening, like clockwork, the great beacon would pierce the darkening horizon like a promise of safety to passing mariners. But something was off in mid-December. On the 17th, the light never came on. From the mainland, fishermen noticed the blackened tower. For the first time in decades, the sea was left without its eye. The Coast Guard assumed it to be an electrical issue. A supply boat was dispatched on the 19th with 2 officers and an engineer, expecting to find Edgar working through the outage. But when they reached the rocky outcrop, the waves unusually calm. No figure greeted them from the platform. No flags waved from the mast. No radio crackled back in reply. They docked in silence. The door to the keeper's quarters was slightly ajar, not broken or forced, just open. Inside, the air was still. A kettle sat on the stove, cold and untouched. A single cup of tea rested on the table, half drunk. The bed was made, boots neatly aligned below the bunk, and Edgar's signature oilskin coat, the one he never went out without, was still hanging by the door. On the desk, the logbook ended abruptly. The last entry, dated December 16th, read simply, "Winds heavy, waves battering the dock, seals on the rocks again, repairs tomorrow." That was all, nothing more. It was as if Edgar had stood up in the middle of his routine and simply walked out into nothing. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no footprints, no evidence of distress. The engineer checked the light mechanism. It was fully functional, no faults in the system, no blown fuses, nothing out of place. The food pantry was stocked, the emergency flares untouched. One of the officers, Lieutenant Halverson, radioed in a brief and stunned report. Lighthouse keeper McClellan not present. Premises in order. No sign of departure. Awaiting orders. The mystery sent a ripple through the small town of Ketchikan, where everyone knew Edgar, not personally perhaps, but as a fixture of the coastal life, a man who had kept them safe in storms with that unwavering beam. Speculation ran wild. Some believed he'd gone mad from isolation and walked into the sea. Others whispered of sea spirits, drawn from Tlingit legend, who punished those who disturbed sacred waters. An older sailor claimed he'd seen a shadow on the water near the rocks the night the light went out, something massive and smooth gliding just beneath the surface. The Coast Guard investigation, though thorough, yielded nothing. Sonar scans showed no wreckage, no body, no debris. Dogs brought to sniff the islet found nothing beyond the doorframe. The case was quietly closed within weeks, declared accidental death due to unknown marine causes. But the locals didn't forget. In the following months, 3 fishing boats reported hearing strange tapping over their radio frequencies when passing Ketchikan Point. 3 slow knocks, then silence. A year later, a child on a whale-watching tour claimed to see a man waving from the rocks, though no one else saw him. The lighthouse, now manned by rotation, became a dreaded post. Men claimed to hear footsteps at night, or feel pressure on their chests as they slept, or return to the lamp room to find the lens freshly wiped without explanation. By the late 60s, it was partially automated, and in 1971, made fully remote. Edgar McClellan's name was etched on a small plaque at the base of the tower, for 32 years of faithful watch, but his story became more than a memory. It became a myth. The disappearance was added to a growing list of unexplained vanishings along the Alaskan coast, where some say the sea keeps what it wants. To this day, mariners still glance toward Ketchikan Point when they pass, waiting for the light, and wondering, always wondering, if its last true keeper is still out there, somewhere in the fog. The official report of Edgar McClellan's disappearance might have been filed, sealed, and buried in the Coast Guard's dusty archives, but it never sat right with Captain Elias North, a man who had once served alongside Edgar during the waning days of World War II. Elias, retired and now quietly teaching navigation to cadets in Juneau, had learned of his old friend's vanishing from a terse newspaper clipping. Veteran lighthouse keeper missing, no trace found. That was it. No tribute, no questions, just silence. But Elias knew Edgar, knew his discipline, His predictability, his reverence for the sea. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. So in early January 1953, under the gray press of winter skies, Elias boarded a ferry with nothing more than a rucksack and a notebook, determined to retrace the last days of a man who had saved his life during a typhoon off Okinawa. He first visited the Coast Guard station at Ketchikan, where his presence, an old, sharp-eyed mariner in a brown coat, was met with polite indifference. The logs had been filed away, the officers reassigned. Still, Elias managed to speak to Lieutenant Halverson, the man who had made the initial discovery. Halverson, now with new silver in his hair and a smoker's cough, recounted the visit with unshakable discomfort. It was like walking into a room just after someone left, but knowing they weren't coming back. He admitted he felt watched the whole time on the islet, though no movement stirred in the fog. Elias pressed him. What about the light mechanism? Was there any chance someone had sabotaged it? Halverson shook his head. Everything was in order, too in order. He remembered that the teacup still had steam rising from it when they first entered, as though someone had been there only minutes before. That detail had never been logged. Elias, scribbling all this into his notebook, grew colder with each word. Something had lured Edgar away from his post, something urgent enough to leave mid-sip of tea, but what? A storm? A call for help? A sound? Determined to see the place with his own eyes, Elias hired a charter fisherman to take him to Ketchikan Point, slipping him cash and asking no questions. They arrived at dawn, the sea listless, the sky a flat pewter. The lighthouse stood like a skeleton against the clouds, its walls weather-beaten but intact, the rotating lens gleaming in the light despite no one maintaining it anymore. Elias stepped off the boat alone. As his boots touched the old concrete platform, a gust swept past him, salty and sharp like a whisper. Inside the lighthouse, the decay was slow but clear. Dust on the shelves, a rusted hinge on the kitchen cabinet, a newspaper yellowed and curling on the desk. But Elias noticed the details others missed. The oilskin coat still hung by the door, but it had been moved an inch to the left. The boots were no longer aligned. A chair had been shifted. The table, when he ran his fingers over it, had a fine coating of dust, except for a narrow circle where the cup had been. He looked to the logbook. The final entry still stared back at him, unchanged. But something tugged at him. Those words, "Seals on the rocks again." It felt insignificant, yet deliberately placed. As the hours passed, Elias climbed the stairs to the lantern room. The lens turned slowly, automatically now, powered by remote systems, but he examined the gear housing anyway. Tucked behind one of the gears, wedged tightly and nearly invisible, was a folded piece of paper. Elias pried it loose. The handwriting was unmistakably Edgar's, sharp, clean strokes. But the note contained only one line. "They're not seals." That was all. No explanation, no signature. Elias stood frozen, the wind pressing against the glass around him. Below, the sea was eerily calm. Returning to the lower levels, Elias decided to inspect the surrounding terrain. Walking around the islet, he noted the jagged cliffs and the narrow southern edge where Edgar often noted seal activity in his logs. As he approached, a strange quiet fell over the rocks. No gulls, no waves breaking. Just a low hum, barely audible, more felt in the bones than heard. It seemed to come from beneath. Peering over the edge, Elias noticed large black stains on the rocks, thick, oily patches that shimmered unnaturally in the gray light. They weren't recent, but they hadn't been there long enough to weather away. He bent down to touch one and recoiled. It was sticky and smelled faintly metallic. That night, Elias camped inside the lighthouse. He couldn't bring himself to sleep in the bunk, so he sat at the table with his notebook, transcribing everything he'd seen. Sometime after midnight, he heard a creak from the stairwell, slow, deliberate, one step at a time. He stood, flashlight trembling in his hand, and called out. No reply. He opened the door to the stairwell and shined his beam upward. Empty, but the air smelled different. Not like mold, not like rust, like brine and rot and electric. The steps were damp, though it hadn't rained. Something had been there. When morning came, Elias left the islet in silence. Back in town, he tried to report what he'd found. The oil patch, the note, the sounds. But no one took him seriously. They humored him as an old friend of the dead, grieving and seeing ghosts. But Elias knew. Something had been watching Edgar McClellan. Maybe not human, maybe not from the sea, but it was real. He began writing letters to newspapers, researchers, even universities. Most ignored him. One man replied, a folklorist named Dr. Howard Ellison from Seattle, who claimed knowledge of strange disappearances along coastal lighthouses, from Oregon to Maine, dating back centuries. Some were chalked up to storms, others were never solved. And in each, there was a pattern. Isolated lighthouse, veteran keeper, no trace left behind, often preceded by strange sea life behavior. Ellison offered to come to Ketchikan. Elias agreed, and in that moment 2 things began: an unofficial investigation, and the return of something waiting beneath the waves. Dr. Howard Ellison stepped off the plane in Ketchikan with the cautious demeanor of a man used to skepticism and ridicule. Tall, with wire-rimmed glasses and a trench coat too light for Alaskan winter, he carried only a leather satchel filled with notebooks, old maritime journals, and something Elias would later call the weight of old knowledge. When Elias met him at the dock, the 2 men exchanged more than a handshake. They exchanged purpose. Over black coffee in a creaky harbor diner, Ellison unspooled what years of fringe research had taught him. "There's a history to lighthouses, Captain North," he began, voice low, eyes glancing around as though the walls could listen. "Every culture that's touched the sea has legends of what waits beyond the edge of the map, but not many notice. When the world went modern, lighthouses became less guarded, automated, abandoned, but the stories didn't stop." He spoke of disappearances in Nova Scotia, in the Outer Hebrides, even the tip of South America, keepers who vanished, final log entries filled with nonsensical ramblings about lights under the water, unearthly howls on clear nights, and, strangely, marine life acting out of rhythm. "They always leave one thing behind," Ellison said, unfolding a yellowed clipping, a photo of a 1921 Cape Cod lighthouse, with a door flung open and boots still by the mat. "Signs of interruption, as if taken mid-thought." Elias leaned in. "Taken by what?" Ellison stared at him for a long moment before responding. "Something we stopped believing in when the lights turned electric." The 2 men agreed to return to Ketchikan Point together, but this time they were prepared, with audio equipment, motion-triggered cameras, and, at Ellison's insistence, a strange wooden talisman etched with concentric circles. "Wards," he explained quietly, "from an old Pacific tribe that believed certain ocean regions were cursed." The journey back to the lighthouse felt heavier now, as if the sea itself was aware of their return. The sky was unusually dark for midday, clouds curling like smoke. As they stepped ashore, Elias noticed something that hadn't been there weeks before, a pattern of circular grooves etched into the dirt near the northern cliff's edge, as if something massive had dragged itself across the land. Ellison examined it without speaking, then took out a small compass. The needle spun erratically. Inside the lighthouse, they found the note Elias had hidden in a cabinet still untouched, but the temperature had dropped inexplicably. Their breath now fogged the air. That night, they set up the equipment. Cameras were positioned on each floor, microphones set to pick up infrasound, frequencies too low for human ears but detectable through tremors. Elias sat near the lantern, watching the lens turn, while Ellison read from a brittle journal penned by a 19th-century keeper who vanished in similar fashion. "The sea speaks," the entry said, "but not with words. When it wants something, it takes." Around midnight, the silence broke, not with wind or waves, but a pulsing hum that rose from the floorboards. The microphones trembled. The compass on Ellison's desk began spinning again. They checked the feeds. One camera, facing the rocks outside, caught flickers, blurry, indistinct shapes rising from the sea's surface. Not ships, not birds. Something else. A shape. Too tall. Too narrow. Too still. As they reviewed the footage frame by frame, the shape appeared to move toward the lighthouse. But nothing could be seen outside. Then, on the 4th floor, the motion alarm triggered. Elias ran down with his flashlight, heart pounding. Nothing. Just the scent again. Brine, metal, and something rotted. On the wall, faintly visible in the dust, were markings. Claw marks, number symbols, carved or scratched hastily into the plaster, concentric circles like the talisman Ellison carried. The next morning, shaken but unhurt, they reviewed the recordings again. One audio file captured a whisper, not a voice, not exactly, but a rhythm. A frequency pattern that repeated every 40 seconds. It sounded almost intentional, a code. Elias couldn't shake the thought. What if Edgar hadn't been taken by force? What if he heard something? Something calling? And what if he answered? Ellison began compiling reports from other lighthouse disappearances. overlaying maps, dates, and sonar anomalies. A pattern emerged, an invisible line of vanishings, stretching across the Pacific Rim like a scar. "This is no coincidence," he muttered. "It's a migration path, but not of whales." They made plans to return again in spring, when the fog cleared and sonar readings could be more precise. But that night, something changed. As they slept, a deep rumble shook the ground. Not an earthquake, more like a groan from beneath. Elias rushed outside and saw it, the sea glowing faintly blue, like bioluminescent plankton stirred by a predator. In the water, far out, something broke the surface. It was mass, smooth, silent, then gone. Ellison stood beside him, pale, clutching the talisman. "They're surfacing," he whispered. "They never went away. They were just waiting." The next day, Elias filed a sealed letter with the Coast Guard. In it, he recounted everything, knowing it would never be believed. Ellison left Alaska quietly, vowing to write a book, though he warned Elias, "They don't like being noticed. If we push too far, we may go the way of the others." Weeks later, a small boat washed up on a beach north of Sitka. It was torn in half. Inside was a waterproof case, with only a single item inside. A tape recorder. The final seconds of the tape were chilling. A quiet voice whispering the same phrase again and again. "The seals. They're watching now." And then a splash.
Spring crept over Alaska like a reluctant guest, melting snow revealing dead roots, swollen rivers whispering secrets under thawing ice. Elias North had changed. Those who knew him before the lighthouse incident said he'd grown quieter, more distant, as though he carried the weight of something too large to speak aloud. He no longer captained tour boats or laughed with dockhands over beer. Instead, he spent his days in a cluttered workshop filled with maps, sonar prints, and ink-stained notebooks. But one thing had stayed constant, his obsession with Edgar Holt. It was in late March that he received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a series of faded photographs, infrared images showing the Ketchikan Point lighthouse surrounded by circular patterns in the waves, spiraling like a fingerprint. Attached was a note in the shaky scrawl he recognized instantly, "Ellison. They're active again. Meet me at Fogwatch Rock. Come alone." That night, Elias returned to the sea. He took only a compass, a flare gun, and a waterproof case holding a page from Edgar's log. "Don't answer it. Not even once." Fogwatch Rock, a jagged outcropping 2 miles from the lighthouse, had long been avoided by fishermen due to unpredictable currents. As Elias approached, the sea grew unnaturally still, like the breath before a scream. On shore, he found Ellison, not alone. The man with him was native Tlingit, older, with skin like driftwood and eyes that seemed to have seen through generations. "This is Salak," Ellison said. "He's the last storyteller of the Tide Keepers." The man did not shake hands. He only said, "You stirred something. Now, it stirs back." Around a fire built with salt-dried cedar, Salak told his tale. Centuries ago, before the settlers and steel ships, his people told of sea guardians, creatures that dwelled in the trenches, far deeper than whales could dive. Not evil, not divine. Observers. Sentinels. But once every few lifetimes, when human noise grew too loud, when lights pierced the deep, they would rise. Not in anger. In warning. "The lighthouse is not to protect man from the sea," he said slowly. "It is to protect the sea from man." Elias listened, unmoving. The old man reached into a pouch and produced an object Elias had seen once before, a carved talisman, but this one was cracked, as if pressure from the ocean had shattered it. "Yours will crack too," Salak said, "when it's too late." That night, Elias returned to the lighthouse alone. The weather was eerily calm, the kind of unnatural silence where even seagulls seemed afraid to cry. As he stepped into the keeper's quarters, the scent was back, salt and iron, but now laced with something fouler, like decay soaked in algae. The floorboards creaked in a rhythm, not random, almost like footsteps. But there was no one there. Then, without warning, the generator died. Total blackness swallowed the structure. Elias lit a flare, the red glow painting the walls like blood. And then he saw them. Symbols. Dozens. Carved into the ceiling, spiraling outward like a language he couldn't read. He backed toward the stairs, but from below came a low groan, the unmistakable sound of metal under pressure. The ocean, perhaps. Or something in it. He climbed the stairs, each step a thunderclap in the silence. At the top, the lantern room was cold. So cold, frost covered the glass despite spring's arrival. He aimed the flare toward the sea. In the distance, near Fogwatch Rock, something immense breached the surface, but unlike whales, this didn't rise and fall. It hovered. Still. Watching. A column of water erupted around it as if the ocean rejected its presence. And then, a sound. Not from his ears, but inside his head, a pressure, a pulse, a message. Images flashed before his eyes. Not memories. Warnings. Keepers over centuries, their faces twisted in terror. Lights going out. Doors swinging open. Silent disappearances. And always, the eyes. Dozens. Hundreds. Watching from the deep. Elias screamed and dropped the flare. Darkness again. But this time, it wasn't silent. Something scraped at the base of the tower. Slow. Wet. Climbing. He scrambled down, grabbed the talisman, and held it against the door. The scraping stopped. Morning came like a mercy. When light finally returned, Elias was gone. Search parties found the lighthouse intact, the logbook open to one phrase written over and over, "It speaks in pressure." Weeks later, a hiker on a coastal cliff north of Juneau discovered a washed-up life jacket and a broken compass. Inside a plastic bottle nearby was a note, water-stained but legible, "The sea remembers." The lighthouse lied. Ellison was never seen again. Solak returned to his village and refused to speak to reporters. But one local journalist, curious and persistent, tracked down Elias's last audio recordings. In one, faint under static and sea roar, a voice could be heard, rasping, distant. Not quite human. Whispering something like a name. Not Elias's. Not Edgar, something older. The journalist, shaken, filed the report but was found 2 days later, having abandoned his apartment. His laptop was left open. On the screen, a paused video frame from the lighthouse footage, timestamped 3:33 a.m. In the corner of the lens, where the rocks met the sea, something moved. A hand. Not reaching up. Pulling something down. That night, the fog rolled back in. Thicker than before. As the days passed, and the spring air grew warmer, the story of Elias North began to shift from news into legend. Locals along the Alaskan coast whispered of strange lights seen pulsing far out at sea, beyond the usual shipping lanes, lights that blinked in threes, then vanished beneath the waves. Some claimed they could hear an echo, a rhythmic pulsing that reverberated through the hulls of their boats like a heartbeat buried beneath the ocean. Among them was Mia Caldwell, a 37-year-old marine biologist and sonar technician who'd recently returned to Ketchikan for a research project funded by the University of Washington. She didn't believe in ghosts or sea monsters, at least not until she listened to a sonar log from March 31st, the night Elias disappeared. What she heard froze her, a deep, drawn-out distortion below 30 Hz, far below human hearing, yet audible through the speakers as a hum that trembled through her ribs. It repeated every 13 seconds, accompanied by a distant clicking, almost like speech. The file was flagged, reviewed, dismissed by the faculty as equipment malfunction. But Mia had worked with sonar long enough to know interference when she heard it. This wasn't interference. It was communication. The deeper she dug, the more anomalies she uncovered. Data purged from research vessels, audio tracks erased, timestamps redacted. A name kept surfacing in restricted files, Project Selkie. She drove 7 hours north to a derelict naval facility long since shut down, hidden in the forest behind Cradle Bay. Inside the ruins, she found a forgotten archive room. Moldy, damp, its file cabinets were rusted shut, but behind one shelf was a box wrapped in plastic, labeled with a single word, redacted. Inside, she found audio cassettes, thermal maps, and a journal belonging to Dr. Amelia Rhodes, a marine psychologist who had once claimed that sea depths could influence human thought. Her last entry read, "They do not speak in words. They speak in pressure, in silence, in dread." But what truly shook Mia was a photograph, dated 1901, only months after the mysterious disappearance at Flannan Isles. In the photo were 3 men standing beside a lighthouse. Behind them, on the rocks, was a 4th figure, almost transparent, blurred, standing slightly too tall, too thin. The resemblance to Elias North was impossible. It wasn't just similar. It was exact. As if history were repeating itself, or folding over. That same week, 2 hikers exploring the southern cliffs reported a low moaning sound coming from inside a cave that didn't exist on their map. They entered, recording video. Only one made it out, incoherent, face scratched, shoes gone. The footage, later leaked online before being removed, showed a narrow tunnel and the unmistakable sound of a man calling for help, from deep within the stone. A voice, trembling, said one word, "North." Mia, now haunted, took her findings to a contact at NOAA, hoping for answers. Instead, she was met with denial, then subtle threats. Her funding was withdrawn, her university login revoked, and she began noticing black sedans parked near her home. But she refused to be silenced. She uploaded a blog post titled "The Selkie Frequency," attaching sonar files and scanned pages from Rhodes' journal. It went viral within hours. Then came the knocks at her door, 3, then silence. No one was ever at the doorstep. She began receiving anonymous emails. Coordinates. Tide schedules. A name she'd never heard, Edgar Holt. It was clear now that something was buried beneath the lighthouse, something old, vast, and alive in ways that defied understanding. So Mia made her decision. She rented a boat under an alias and returned to the lighthouse. It was dusk when she arrived, the sun bleeding into the horizon, and she could feel the hum through the water before she even docked. It was stronger now, rhythmic, calling. Inside the lighthouse, the air felt heavy, like stepping underwater. She climbed to the top. The beacon wasn't spinning. The lens was cracked. Etched into the inside of the glass were symbols, circles, spirals, and one unmistakable eye. Her radio chirped. 3 short bursts. Then silence. She hadn't turned it on. In the basement, behind a metal grate, she found an old access tunnel sealed with rusted bolts. It took an hour to open. Inside was a stone staircase spiraling downward, carved long before the lighthouse was built. The smell grew worse, salt, rot, and something like copper. Her flashlight flickered. The deeper she went, the stronger the pulse. Her ears rang. Her vision swam. She reached a stone chamber, circular, with smooth walls. At its center was a hole, a shaft descending into black water. Carved into the floor was a phrase, "They see in silence." She heard breathing. Not hers. Then a hand burst from the water, not reaching for her, but offering something. A compass. Elias's compass. She reached out, trembling, and touched it. And in that moment, the silence roared. Image, not visions, memories. Of every person the sea had claimed. Their last thoughts. Their final breaths. The lighthouse wasn't a warning. It was a beacon. A trigger. A lure. And they were coming again. Not to kill. To reclaim. She fled, the compass clutched in her hand, the pulse now inside her. As she surfaced, the sea was alive with light, faint blue flickers stretching to the horizon. Shapes moved beneath the waves, long and fast and impossible. The fog rolled in, thicker than night. Mia barely made it to shore, collapsing on the sand. She was found 2 days later by fishermen, muttering the same phrase over and over, "It speaks in pressure. It speaks in dreams." She would never speak coherently again. But before she vanished into the institution, she left one last audio log, recovered from her damaged recorder. In it, a deep voice, not hers, whispers through static, "Not gone. Waiting." And then a click. And then silence. Weeks passed after Mia Caldwell's final message, and the world began to forget. News of her disappearance faded into conspiracy blogs and obscure Reddit threads. The authorities issued a quiet statement. Mental breakdown. No credible evidence found. The official files were sealed. But beneath the surface, beneath the silence, something stirred. Miles away, in a cramped Boston apartment lined with sonar charts and discarded audio reels, 62-year-old Edgar Holt, a retired cryptologic technician for the Navy, heard the signal again. He hadn't heard it in 40 years, not since the Selkie Channel project was abruptly shut down and every member reassigned or silenced. They had called it Whale Echo in public, but the classified name was Operation Hollow Light. Holt had once believed they were intercepting foreign submarines or seismic activity. But now he knew better. The signal wasn't from this Earth, not entirely. It was ancient. Purposeful. A language not meant for humans. When Holt discovered Mia's leaked files and heard the frequencies she captured, the old terror returned like a flood. He knew what it meant. They were waking up. The sea was no longer quiet. And the lighthouse in Ketchikan wasn't alone. It was one of 7. Built above fault lines and lay crossings, each one forming a perfect ring around the North Pacific. An ancient perimeter. A cage, or a seal. One by one, they were failing. He reached out to a former colleague, Meredith Shaw, now working at a private satellite array in Colorado. She confirmed strange readings, heat blooms beneath the ocean, in places where no volcanic activity should exist. Massive structures moving slowly beneath the crust. And one signal, growing stronger by the hour, pulsing from the center of the ring, the Challenger Deep. Together, they tracked energy surges. The epicenter was beneath a trench, a place so deep no probe had returned intact. Holt contacted a journalist, Lena Reyes, known for uncovering military cover-ups. He gave her everything, blueprints, sonar recordings, old logs from the lighthouse keepers who'd gone mad, Rhodes' journal, and Mia's last words. Lena, skeptical at first, took a trip to Ketchikan. What she found wasn't just a story, it was a scar in the world. Locals refused to speak of the lighthouse. Children cried at the sight of it. Fishermen had started quitting, leaving nets in the sea. One man jumped from the cliffs, screaming that, "They are under our feet." Lena returned with photos, GPS logs, and a video of the lighthouse lens spinning, though the structure had long since lost power. It glowed blue, pulsing in rhythm with the tide. On her flight home, Lena vanished. The plane dropped off radar 200 miles off the coast of British Columbia. No wreckage was ever found. In her absence, Holt knew time was up. The signal had passed 200 decibels, stronger than any seaquake. The perimeter was broken. Something had breached. He decoded the final transmission from the original Selkie project tapes. It translated to one word, remember. And then another, return. He realized the sea wasn't calling. It was commanding. Not just to Elias. Not just to Mia. To all of them. Humans, long separated from something older, something buried beneath bone and blood. A call to come home, to the dark. Around the world, strange weather began. Fish washed ashore by the thousands. Migrating whales turned back and beached in droves. Storms spun in patterns that defied meteorology, spirals matching the carvings inside the lighthouse. Power grids flickered. Radio stations caught static pulses. Deep-sea cables failed. Then, in late August, the final blow, a ship broadcasting SOS signals from the Mariana Trench sent one last message before contact was lost. It said simply, "It sees us now." The final days came quiet. Not with fire or war, but with memory. People began dreaming of drowning, millions at once. They dreamt of old lighthouses crumbling, of eyes opening beneath coral, of songs sung in pressure and salt. Entire towns woke up covered in seawater, though miles from shore. On September 3rd, the sky over the Pacific shimmered. Not with light, but with absence. The ocean stilled. Boats froze. Animals fled the coasts. And from the depths, they rose. Not creatures. Not gods. Not aliens. Echoes. Forms made of memory and water and pain, every lost sailor, every drowned child, every forgotten name given shape. The ocean had kept them. And now it returned them. To remind. To reclaim. To remember. In the final moments, recordings captured voices, not screams, but whispers. You built lighthouses to forget. We built darkness to forgive. And then, silence. The sea swallowed whole towns. Islands vanished. But some survived. In lighthouses still standing. In caves untouched. In memories that refused to drown. A year later, a boy in Norway sketched the lighthouse from Mia's files, though he'd never seen it. A girl in Argentina hummed the sonar pulse in her sleep. The sea had changed. The world had changed. But it hadn't ended. Not quite. Because the message remained. Buried in the noise. Waiting. Remembering. A single phrase on a buoy floating where Alaska's coast once stood, they see in silence. They forgive in drowning. And far beneath the deepest trench, a light blinked once. Then twice. Then stopped. Not gone. Just, watching.